I just want to show everyone my naked 3PO helmet up close and do a little bit of sort of a discussion about how I built this and some of the design features and some of the improvements that I've made to my skills since building this helmet. So this is my naked 3PO helmet. It's basically just PVC foam board. Most of it is just single layer. Some parts have been doubled up to create the details of the original character. The eyes are made from PVC tubes or parts like PVC fittings, and you can see up close it's not really perfect. There's quite a lot of imperfections in this actual helmet. From a distance it looks really great, but for me, being up close and personal with this thing all the time, I really noticed some of the flaws in it. So like I mentioned before, the eyes, I use quite a lot of parts that I can buy off the shelf if possible, just to make manufacturing and building stuff quick. But the eyes are all completely handmade, as you can tell. But I used, these eyes are probably like 7th generation versions of 3PO eyes that I've made multiple types, trying different materials, because I don't have a printer, and I sort of don't really want a printer because I think it's important to be able to demonstrate your capability of building things from scratch, unless you just want something, perfect, something that you can paint and wear and be really usable. I actually get a lot of joy out of being able to fabricate something from scratch, and I really enjoy that process. That's part of the reason why I like building stuff, is not just so much that I can have something quickly. It's more about, for me, the process and the journey of creating something from scratch and then being able to present the world with your craft and show people your skills. But as the years go by, my skills improve. I look back on some of my things that I've made and I just think, what was I thinking? But it's just out of necessity, you come up with ideas, and I really don't think this looks as bad as what I'm saying it does. From a distance, it looks incredible. People don't really pay that much attention. But for me, and my abilities now, I look at this and think, wow, this is pretty low grade, But this was made entirely with PVC tubes. I think I've even hand cut them with a hacksaw to make them shorter. All of these struts I cut from pop rivet shanks. So then I just super glued them in and sanded them smooth, but you can see that like the spacing's not perfect. It's very difficult to make something like this on a circle be perfect. I think I used a paper pattern, drew the lines and glued my wires onto a paper pattern, and then attempted to glue the circular piece up on top of the paper and on top of the ribs. And then I used super glue and setting spray to fill in these edges, and I've tried to use my Dremel to Dremel out any drips and overhangs, and it doesn't look great. This is why 3D printers are so great, because you can produce fine details like this a lot better. But like I mentioned before, from a distance, no one's really going to notice that. They just see the ribs and the frames and cages, and it looks pretty good. But this is one of the things that I'm very conscious of at the moment, and I want to rebuild those. Also with the eyes, these fittings that I used, I found parts that just closely resembled the movie puppet, or the character from the movie, and the way that it was built, but they're completely inaccurate. So that's something I would really like to refurbish and rebuild. While I'm on the front of the helmet, there's another bit of detailing here that I'm not entirely impressed with or happy with. Now, this mouth plate, I've actually made it maybe 2 or 3 times. After the second time, I had to re-sculpt the tops of the or the sides of the nose section because they weren't quite right. But further analysis of reference images now shows that well, it's funny that like I notice things or things look differently in time. Like after I've built this, I look back and I think, oh well, you know, these bits could be modified. The droid in the movie, it's kind of hard to tell, but the more I look at it, the more I realize that these points actually need to come out a bit wider, and this kind of curve here sort of needs to be sculpted just a little bit more. But when you're hand making things, nothing ever really works out perfectly, and I like to eyeball practically everything I build, and it helps visually get a good sort of overall aesthetic, but it's never ever absolutely 100% accurate or exactly perfect. But it doesn't really matter because overall I've tried to adjust these shapes and the design of this mostly to fit my face, but to as closely resemble the movie character as much as possible. But one of the other things that I need to do with this face plate, other than finish it nicely because it doesn't look great, is this detail here. I've got a bit of a bevel on that edge, which is something I did when I did a minor refurbishment to this helmet about a year ago, or just over a year ago. Is this line here. It's kind of hard to tell, but the more I analyze reference photos, as many different angles as I can find, which there's not a lot of them, I've noticed that this outer surface and this part here are actually one. The way I've built this was my interpretation of the reference images initially was that this steps down, but I've been looking and researching more and more, and it looks to me like this surface and this surface actually have like a bit of a bend here along this edge, and then this surface here actually angles down a little bit, and then this part steps out the way I've got it here. But that's something that I want to adjust to make it look a little bit more authentic. I'm not quite sure where I got the idea to have that grill with the holes. I think I may have seen an image somewhere, but that was also an addition that I added later. I call that the Lego plate. But that was open originally, and I closed it off and just kind of weathered it a little bit, which I think actually looks a lot better because it hides my mouth inside. Not that you can see it really when I'm wearing it, but I wanted to get rid of that. Just going back to the eyes quickly, the way I've got the eyes mounted on these posts and connected to the eyebrow part, that's really the only thing that holds this mouth plate in place, other than the struts, which kind of just twist out of these little teacup hooks. It's kind of hard to do this. Just sitting on my bed here. I'm just going to use my foot to hold this for a second. But that's how I get my head in and out, by just detaching these little struts here. Oh, I can't really get that one right now. But when it comes to the structural integrity of the front of the helmet or the front of the faceplate, the only thing that really holds this faceplate in position is those little struts with the eye section in between. So structurally, this is not super strong, but it is reinforced quite a lot with all the wiring. The wiring offers some flexibility. I mean, PVC foam board is fairly flexible on its own. If you flex it too much, it can crack and snap, but I haven't had any issues. I have had some cracks and breakages in these supports for the eyes and the mouth, but they're fairly easy to fix. So that is part of what I want to refurbish with this. Also, the design of the original 3PO puppet head, there's some other sort of mechanical and structural details in between the eyes, which I would like to incorporate into the helmet. But moving on from that, you know, like I said, those two like struts there are the only thing that really holds this into position along with the wires. But going into the eyebrow section is actually quite strong. It has, I think that's a double layer, or maybe it's sort of like 50% of this beam here is a double layer coming out from the helmet. I think I even have a cross member spar that goes through the horseshoe frame to the back section, which does give it some sort of structural support in there. And then I've got two cross-cut beams, so the raw edges are on the outside, and then the structural surfaces of the material are either side of that. So that section there is this bone part, or like the forehead bone, I guess you could call it. That structure there is actually relatively strong, and what this eyebrow plate mounts onto. But when I talk about some of the skills and techniques that I've adapted since building this helmet, are things like this edge. I would never leave an edge looking like this. If I was to rebuild this whole helmet right now, this edge would never look like that. And the reason it looks like that is, I don't know if you can really see that, it's kind of raised up. There's like a bit of a raised up burr along there. That along with these kind of raw edges of the PVC foam board, I would never leave anything to chance like that. You know, if I was to remake this now, these edges are actually raised up because I've used the heat gun on the material, and rather than, you know, really sanding that back and refinishing those edges, this is why it's kind of swollen and it flares. Like, so the edges of PVC, because it's a foam, essentially a foam core, the foam cells, or the air cells, sorry, in the material actually swell. And then when it cools, it just stays like that. So that's something I wouldn't ever leave these days. I would actually finish that off, and I would, you know, really smooth that out. Another thing that I wouldn't do these days with this material is just paint it directly onto the material. Like I said, I would be sanding this a lot smoother and getting it really finished first. And one of the new techniques that I do now is I coat my PVC products in 3D printer resin, and I use the UV light to cure it. So, you know, things like the raw edges, which when you just paint over, the paint kind of tends to absorb into that like a sponge, and that's why you get these kind of nasty looking raw edges which don't quite look that good. You can get away with it sometimes, like on this 3PO helmet, you can get away with it somewhat because he's meant to look really rough. But if I was getting something or building something that I wanted a really, really nice smooth finish off, like a glossy kind of coating, there's no way in hell I would ever leave raw edges like that. I'd be coating all of that in resin, curing it with the UV light, and sanding it back really, really nice and getting a really good surface finish on it first. But having said that, that's how I did this helmet 2 years ago, and you know, it still looks good. I've never had anyone say, "Oh, that doesn't look right," but that's how I did it. These are actual real rivets. I drilled them through. But like I said, if I was building this now, I probably wouldn't have drilled those through prior to painting. I'd probably add them on later. But a lot of this helmet was modified and rebuilt several times. Now, another thing that is wrong with this helmet is I actually had someone criticize that the eyes are too close together. But, you know, to be honest, like, this is actually more proportionate to a real 3PO helmet than it is the movie puppet version. And obviously, like, I'm adapting a puppet to be wearable. So, you know, the eyes have to be in position so that I can see out of it. That's why they're kind of close together. But you'll notice in the movie puppet, if you get like a close-up photo of the face, the eyes are almost a whole eye diameter in between apart, which is like not humanly possible to wear. but also because the head on the puppet was a lot smaller. So having to build this whole, thing to go over a human head obviously needs to expand the proportion slightly, and that therefore makes the eyes look a lot closer together. But you know what? Like I said before, overall, no one's really going to nitpick something like that because there's a person inside it, so the performer has to be able to see what they're doing. So moving on from there, there's some other details that with this helmet that are not entirely correct. In my journey of building the cutaway 3PO models, I did a lot more research, and I know how to build these sections here a little bit more accurate. These were just kind of, I don't know why I built these like this, but it is what it is. They're just mounted onto little plates. There's a lot of construction techniques that I did back when I built this that, they're very, they're very low grade, these things were just, I don't even know how I cut these out. I might have used a hole saw, I'm not entirely sure, but there's a lot of things that I would do differently now. These are completely inaccurate, but from a distance they look okay. They just add a little bit of texture to the massive wires. They look like something, but they don't look right. I've got them on both sides. They're obviously very handmade and not quite accurate, and they don't match either side. There's a lot of things on this helmet that don't match side to side, but there's a lot going on that you don't notice those tiny little details. They just add something else. They just add context to what you're looking at. I used a lot of things that are obviously completely inaccurate, but like I said before, they just add something to the overall aesthetic of the piece. These are just, I think they're RCA leads for audio, and I can buy them from a shop with just no internal parts in them, and I just added wires into them, and I think they look nice because they have some real metal textures, just to kind of offset all the wiring. I think wiring is more believable when it's got some things that look like plugs or something, some sort of mounting system. These are just another version of coaxial cable things, and they're just glued into place. And they really do add a lot of sort of realism to something that is quite obviously not real. When I did a minor refurbishment to this helmet just before Comic-Con last year, there was a lot of details that I had missed, and I went back and sort of added parts in that weren't quite right, just to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. So this is just, I had a red wire here before, or maybe a yellow wire, I can't remember, but I had to locate something to be able to wrap it with, and I ended up stripping yellow PVC sheath off a USB cable and super glued and wrapped it around the original red cable that I had here, because that's what I found in reference images. He has that. And since building this helmet, all my successive cutaway models that I've built, they've all got this basically the same sort of look about them. A lot of these ribbon wires I added and really tried to style them to look as close as I could to the movie puppet. So even the way that they're connected and wrapped, all of these little bits and pieces, you sort of don't notice them from a distance. They just blend into the rest of the head. But when you really look up close and nitpick reference images, I've really tried to mimic that with these particular wires, and I think it makes it more believable. Another thing that I did a while back was when I refurbished a lot of this wiring and pulled things out and added bits that were missing. Has another little piece that I added, and I wrapped really thin bits of black plastic around these thin wires, and I really tried to color match them. I had to detach every wire off this mouth plate part off the nose, because originally I had all these wires terminating into the point, And when I went back and really analyzed a lot of the images, I noticed that the way I had them was not right. And so I repositioned them all to reflect the original design, which is connecting into the side of the nose. So that was a really important thing to do, I think, because it makes this look more believable and more authentic, just with a few key changes. Even the way, like this white wire here, for example, and this S, I pretty much added those in because they are exactly like what you see on the movie Droid. And even if you don't notice those details exactly, I think it's really important to try and capture the image of the real thing, because no matter what angle you look at this from, you'll notice familiar things, whether you've noticed them or not. Because before, I kind of just creatively did my own thing and it wasn't right. So I went back and refurbished a lot of this, changed a lot of what's going on in here to really make it look more realistic. Don't know if I mentioned these struts. These struts are actually made from, this is going to sound really stupid, but these are toilet cistern button things. They're like replacement parts for toilets, basically. These are just like grey plastic with like a screw on one end, which allows you to repair the button on an old toilet. And this is just a clear acrylic tube, and this is a cap, like a tube cap, like for electrical conduit. And so I just basically glued them all together, and I've got like little eye screws, and there's two of them. I don't know if you can really see that, but it's two brass screws with an eyelet on top, and then I've just used a rivet. Oh, come back 3PO. I've used a rivet to just hold them into place. So they don't really need to be super strong, but there's a little bit of, I've got the ability to screw and unscrew just a little bit, enough to get this to slip out of the teacup hook. I put a sewing pin head through there. Strangely, I mean, when I look at this up close, I think it looks really dodgy, but the movie Droid, the design actually looks really similar to this. Even the teacup hooks on the side of the chin. The 3PO puppet had some really hectic looking hardware in there, which surprisingly looks very, very similar to this, as dodgy as it looks up close on this version that I built. These bits here look pretty close. The only difference being the diameter of this tube is a little thick, and this part here is obviously a circular cap, but the movie Droid has like a hexagon nut kind of thing there. And then the only other thing that's a bit different is there shouldn't be any little cuts in this tube, or in this strut thing, but that's basically it. These side bits, like, they never really looked right, but I just used parts off the shelf because my skills of hand making the bits that I want was not entirely great at the time when I built this. So I just used bits and pieces that I could mimic what looks right. So they're just, again, like PVC, electrical PVC fittings just put together. I've used PVC foam board just to kind of create that detail, which is similar to the back of the head. These are supposed to look like sort of smallish versions of that. They're not at all accurate, but like I said before, from a distance, you just see something that looks kind of similar and you don't really question it. So moving on to the center frame. So the center frame is basically what I started with, and this is just like literally a horseshoe shape, a circular horseshoe shape that goes right the way around. It's basically the superstructure, if you will, or the chassis of the entire helmet is basically built off that horseshoe. There's literally it's literally one layer of 3mm PVC, and then everything else is just kind of bonded onto that. That's one of the things I would have changed if I was to rebuild this now. I mentioned before about the 3D printer resin that I use. Like, there would be no seam lines like that visible if I was going to rebuild this today. This would all look very, very solid. All my 3PO cutaway, naked 3PO with the half face plates that I built and sold, they are all constructed very, very similar to this, except with the addition of all the internal structure, which I can't have on this because my head is sitting in here. But my 3PO cutaways, I think I'll just add a picture here so you can see if I've got the ability to do that. Oh, actually, I'm not going to add a picture. I'm not sending this to YouTube. Yeah, so then there's just like these other little details. I think these were cut into the original horseshoe shape. And then this section, come back. This back section originally was meant to be one piece, but I couldn't get it to be the right size exactly, so I ended up cutting it and making it wider. But essentially this outer shell piece was meant to just be one part that goes on and wraps around and kind of connects at the top. My other 3PO cutaways that I've made are like that. They're one piece, and then all of these pieces here are just obviously bonded to the back section. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty basic, but you know, like I said, like the overall image of this, you can tell it's naked 3PO. Like, there's no questions who it's meant to be. So it looks good, but I'm going to refinish all of this because these little seam lines, they're not meant to be there. And there's also some other bits that I want to do, some other adjustments I want to do to this helmet. When I'm wearing it, it is very, very closely hugging. Well, is that the word? It closely fits the back of my head. And so much so that my sort of back of my head and my neck just really sits close to this edge, and that's actually not quite right. So to lift this edge out off the back of my head slightly, I need to fill this in with some bunches of wires, and that will kind of make the helmet profile look a little bit more like the movie one. I made this a little bit more in the style of a guy on Instagram who built the naked 3PO skull for The Rise of Skywalker. He modified the original design and made it a little bit more like mine, a little bit more low profile. There's quite a few designs, features that I stole from his 3D model to construct this one, but I do want to modify this one to look a little bit more true to the original 3PO helmet, and it will also make it more wearable for me and give it a bit more space, because at the moment it's a bit tight and I want to adjust and change all of that. So I'm just moving on to this back section. We've got a top plate that kind of glues on, well, it's glued on top of this outer shell part, and then there's another piece that comes down here, and they've just got just some aesthetic parts, like these rivets. They're not really structural, they're just glued on there for looks. And then I just want to show you these bits, these antennae looking things. Years ago, when I made my first 3PO costume, I made these out of brass beads and washers and wires and all sorts of little bits and pieces that I found, and they looked really good, but they were actually the neck bolts for my original costume. But I really liked the look of them, and I thought the naked 3PO needed something in here. Again, the guy on Instagram that I saw, his design had some sort of like cool thing sticking out there, so I ended up just adapting the pieces that I had made previously and just used them just to be some sort of antenna, just to create a little bit more context to make this look like a real robot. And they fit quite neatly above my head and just kind of fill in the back and add some more detailing. A lot of these wires, it's very difficult to find images of 3PO's head when he's naked, especially at the back. So a lot of these, I think I just kind of created to give it like some sort of matching aesthetic to the front, but you know, no one really gets to see what the original 3PO head looks like at the back. So I was just kind of did my own thing for that. Here's another dodgy handmade thing that I did, which I'm not super proud of, but again, from a distance, you just see, you know, the familiar shapes and you think, oh yeah, that looks about right. I don't quite remember how I made this. I believe that some of this is cast resin from some sort of lid. I poured resin into some sort of lid of a washing liquid bottle or something, and then used a drill and a Dremel, and I think I Dremeled these bits out by hand, but I can't really remember how I did it. But yeah, like I said, it kind of looks somewhat like the head disc on 3PO, so that's all it's required to do. Just as long as it looks right, that's good enough for me at that stage. But I do have some 3D printed parts which I've cast, and so I would probably rebuild that with a 3D printed part now, which I got my friend to make me. But that's about as much of 3D printing I've ever used on anything, and that's more of a recent thing. But I generally tend to try and challenge myself to make stuff look authentic without 3D printers. But you know, when push comes to shove and I'm running out of time and I just don't have the patience, I do sometimes now get little bits done, but nothing on a major scale is ever 3D printed for me. So yeah, these bits here are all going to be refurbished. One of the things I'm going to do with the back helmet is actually separate it along here somewhere, maybe there. It doesn't really matter how I do it or where I do it, but that is going to have an extension along that line to really push the back of the helmet out slightly. And I'm thinking of putting like a ridge in there to make this back section look a little bit thicker and more chunky, just so that it looks a little bit more authentic from images I've seen. There'll be a lot of resin coating done on this. Under here, as I mentioned before, there's going to be a lot more bunches of wire in a lot of the pictures where you can see the back of the helmet. This section is probably a little bit wide here, and that needs to be a little bit more narrow from the top edge, according to the original designs. But I did use some design features of the guy who built the Rise of Skywalker Babu Freak section of the movie, with all the scenes with Babu Freak when the back of 3PO's helmet is off. I made this to look a little bit more like that, which, you know, I don't really like. It's sort of, I really want to keep things looking more original. I'm going to rebuild these sections and really change some of these details here on the side to reflect the real droid. But anyway, so that's a in-depth look and discussion about my naked 3PO helmet, how I built it, and the way I'm going to modify this to be a little bit more realistic. I hope you liked watching this video. I know it's quite a long video, but I think it's nice to share my work with people who are interested, and I hope that you can learn from my techniques and all the things that I've learned and taught myself. I hope that you can adapt some of those skills and techniques to your own work. But feel free to shoot me a message if you ever want to talk shop, if you ever have some queries or questions, or you ever have any feedback or anything that you want to run by me or anything. Just I'm usually always on my social media, and I love chatting to all my followers and fans. Yeah, and I especially when it comes to building things, I love sharing techniques and you know, and helping each other. So yeah, feel free to drop me a line anytime and I will do my best to get in touch with you back. But anyway, that's my naked 3PO helmet. I hope you I hope you enjoyed listening and watching this video. Yeah, hope to chat to you soon. Take care, guys, and may the 4th be with you.